how do you define what makes something newsworthy? How do you know when it's a story?
Yeah, that is a great question. I don't think there's a simple, easy answer. I think a lot of it depends on sort of living in the news. And some of it will depend on, what your beat is, what you're covering. It'll vary from time to time. The thing that I try to tell our reporters at the Dispatch is we don't have beats. We don't believe in beats. I don't have somebody who covers. We have a congressional newsletter, but she writes frequently about human rights in China too. So it's not like a strict beat. And the thing that I try to encourage our reporters to do is look carefully for what they think is a story, bring it back and socialize it with the editors, talk about it with their colleagues, see if other people think it's a story the way that you describe it, and then if it's a story, live in the story, become part of the story, stick with the story. There are very few things, because we try to do deep contextual reporting that furthers understanding rather than sort of quick hits and clickbaity stuff. We want people to become obsessed with their stories. I think it's a good thing. So I tell them, go and find your niche, find your story, and then live in it until you find something else. And then just part of the reporting process, and I'm sure you both have found this, the better sourced you are and the more you're living in a story, at some point in journalism, as you're doing story development, as you're brainstorming, as you're doing source development, everything sort of flips. So at the beginning of the process, you're chasing things, you're trying to come up with stories, you're trying to get people to talk to you. And then at some point, either on a specific story or maybe on a career trajectory, everything flips. And then you're trying to figure out, okay, which stories am I not going to do? Because there are so many different things I could do with this set of facts that I could chase further. And that becomes an important moment. And we talk a lot about that at the Dispatch.
One interesting note about this question of beats, you're absolutely right that there is that kind of shape to a journalist's engagement in a specific story and in a beat over time and in a career over time. I think there's real pros and cons to this question of honing in on a beat and becoming rich in sourcing in it. It's something you need to do to an extent to crack a story. You have to kind of excavate that whole world, whether it's an industry or a part of government or whatever, and get it wired. But I have a unique vantage point on this because I've never really developed a specific beat, right? I do national security stuff. I do stuff that's around the entertainment industry, the news media, law enforcement, the intelligence community. Like it really runs the gamut. And the through line is, crimes and cover-ups. And there are shared sources that allow me to kind of lily pad hop across those things. But, I, like everyone else, I face a choice in doing that, as opposed to just drilling down on, okay, now I've done a big national security story. It's all going to be NatSec sources who come at me naturally. And part of that is just the way my career has happened to evolve and where my interests lie. And maybe a resistance to being pigeonholed, that I want the challenge of broadening in that way constantly. And there are downsides to that as well. But part of it is also a conscientiousness about a risk I see play out all the time of people become beat reporters, and they're incredible beat reporters, and thank God we have them. But they also then become at risk of kind of clientitis with respect to their sources. Yeah. So this occurred to me when Brooke was talking about law enforcement sources. All the time in daily newspapers, and I mean the best of the daily newspapers that do wonderful work on these beats, you see reports that come directly from a senior White House official, a senior law enforcement official, FBI official. Right. That is. So in my kinds of contentious investigative stories, you'd get killed for that kind of widespread anonymous sourcing. I would never hang a story on that. But it is very acceptable practice in certain types of beat reporting, partly because there is, I think, this largely fallacy of the reliability of law enforcement and government sources, where it's just totally acceptable to attribute in that way. And you really do see a common thread of reporters get lied to. And it's very difficult for reporters who are drilled down on a beat to navigate that challenge because they really do depend on a cycle of access. And I've seen this from an outside perspective because I have the opposite frustration. Like, I'm going in, I'm doing an intelligence laundering story. I'm gonna piss off that FBI spokesperson. I'm gonna be blacklisted for the next story, maybe for the next 5 years of story. And I know that when I do these stories. And it's like, it's horrible. And the only way to deal with it is, from my standpoint, like, you keep going and you keep pissing people off and you hope that your stories get enough traction that they're kind of forced to still talk to you.
Yeah.
But it does, you see why it's not the most widespread model. It's really like taxing, and there are sustainability questions around it. But then it also does make you worry when you see these like daily newspaper stories where it's the same reporter dealing with the same law enforcement sources, and stuff makes it into those that are, even in spite of the best intentions of the reporter, press releases from these law enforcement places.
Well, it probably helps you that you work for a place like the New Yorker, which has the reputation that it does. So if you're calling a spokesman for the FBI or a regional FBI office and you say, hey, I'm working on a story, the first thing they're going to think is, oh shit. Like, and I don't want this to be in the New Yorker, right?
Yeah.
They don't have the luxury of blowing you off because you work for a smaller paper or a,
That's what I rely on, and from your mouth to God's ear, I hope that dynamic continues to exist.